All right, our next tutorial, we're going to be talking about noses. Yay, who doesn't love noses? Me, I don't really like my nose, but that's okay. So noses have just as much variety as eyes do. We're most used to seeing noses that are front facing like this, or like this. Hello. But when we start looking in a profile view, we have changes that happen just like that side view eye versus a frontal facing eye. And then even one last layer would be like a 3/4 view of a nose, where the viewer is viewing the person from kind of an acute angle, and we get to see kind of a partial nostril over here and a lot of the side of the nose. This kind of view is actually my favorite to draw because I feel like you get to see kind of the most of the human face. You get both eyes, you get a cool like line happening with the nose, you get most of the lips as well, you get a fun cheekbone over here. So 3/4 view is always, in my opinion, the most interesting, but we're going to take a look today at frontal, profile, and 3/4 altogether. So we're going to just talk stylizing of noses first, and then we'll talk about how to find little nuances. So your nose is pretty much made up of 3 little circles, one for the ball of our nose, and then 2 for our nostrils. Now, here's the thing. When you're looking at yourself, you may end up having nostrils like this dude's, where the nostrils actually end kind of straight in line with the ball of the nose. Or you may have a nose like this, where the nostrils hit above the ball of the nose, like this, okay? And then there are times, depending on the picture that you're using, where the nostrils themselves will end way below the ball of the nose. So that's kind of how you want to think about this structure, is which type of nose am I looking at, and how can I make sure that I get those nostrils kind of in the right placement. The next thing to sort of consider is whether or not you have sort of a wedge-shaped nose, or really, like, we would call it like a button nose. So there's all sorts of different shapes and varieties. We're just going to kind of play around with some simplified versions. So I like to think about this as like an infinity sign to get the nostrils in the right place. So we want to think about a curve that comes down, up, it's going to scoop around the bottom of the nose. Then it's going to come back around and be uniform on the other side. So just a quick little, like a roller coaster loop, if you will. And those are going to form our little interiors of our nostril. Then we have the outside of our nostril that hooks around those little sesame seeds and comes in and typically connects with the bridge of the nose that we can see here. Now again, sometimes the outside of the nose is very curved, sometimes it's flatter, so you're going to have to look either at yourself or at your reference picture very, very carefully to decide what kind of nostril shape you have. And then the balls that we've drawn here will assist us with placing the value appropriately. So we also have that little, it's oftentimes called the little Cupid's arrow that comes down from the underneath side of the nostril, which will eventually taper into our mouth structure. So we're going to today we're just going to kind of put in an upper lid line, just so, lip line, not lid line, just so that you can kind of see how that would come into play. Then as the bridge of the nose starts to eke up, sometimes you'll have sort of a diamond shape that happens across the structure. Sometimes it will be just a vertical line. Sometimes it'll arc and sort of bow in, so that there's a compression that happens across the nostril area. So again, all sorts of different nose shapes. So one would be where we have kind of a slight tapering in, almost like looking at a bridge from above. Sometimes you'll have sort of a diamond shape that happens, where you get sort of a more articulated septum area. And then sometimes it'll be just a widening that happens like so. So for example, with this guy, you can see that it's more of this shape, where there's a bit more of a taper that happens like so. This guy has just a slight diamond shape, where you can see this happening across the top of the bridge of the nose. So choose a shape that kind of works for you or your face. I'm going to sort of arc in that slight diamond shape. It doesn't have to be super crazy. And then across the bridge of the nose, this is where the kind of magic starts to happen. Now, I will say this, drawing a nose straight from the front is kind of tricky because most of the value is going to be concentrated on the underneath side of the nose, lifting the highlights up, right? So we want to think about placing some value on the underneath side of the nostril here, on the underneath side of the rim of the nose, and the underneath nostril here as well. Now, oftentimes you'll get to see like a little tiny highlight that kind of accents along the rim of the nostril where the skin actually lifts before it tucks in. So if you can capture that little subtlety, it's pretty fun. And typically the value kind of falls in line with that initial sort of curly shape that we drew, where it's going to arc around the nostril area before kind of feathering out. We also want to think about having some value that comes into the side of the nose to push the ball of the nose up. If we don't have any value happening over here, it's going to be real hard for the top of the nose to feel like it's more distinguished from the bottom of the nose. Then the thing that happens a lot of times, especially with young artists, is that they want to go in and like just draw like really hard lines around the nostrils. And I'll show you why it happens. Look at that. There's a line that happens around the nostril, Miss Brown. And I would say, yeah, you're right. But that line is actually value. It's a dark shadow that's happening. So rather than just drawing a line, we want to quickly like fade that out. So what would that look like? It would look like this. We're going to go ahead and do a nice dark line, but then we're going to fade that out. We're going to keep that line fading out into the cheekbone. So rather than thinking about it just as a line, think about the fact that your nose, big or small, wide or flat, any of those things in between, it's got a shape to it. And those depressions in your face, right, before your cheekbones start to push out, are actually making little tiny areas of light and dark across your face. It's pretty cool. You're like a map. This eventually is going to fade into our cheek. This eventually is going to taper into that shadow that creates some definition of the mouth itself. We'll have a shadow that happens all along the underneath side here. People are usually really hesitant to do this. Trust me though. And I want to have some value that happens along this lip line as well. So here's the thing, if you put your finger right in the middle of your mouth there, you'll notice that there's a depression, right? It sinks down. So one side of this is going to be dark, one side is going to be light. We kind of have our light coming in from the front and kind of right. That's why we're getting these cool highlights. So we're going to allow this side to be darker, which means this side is also going to be darker. We don't want it to look like stripes on our face. We want it to be nice and soft. But in general, we're going to have more value that happens to the left here, a little bit of value that happens here, and just a scooch of value under here as we start to think about where that cheekbone is going to come in. Same thing up top. We're going to think about having some value that comes on either side of that ball of the nose, as well as some value that happens on either side of the nose here and here. Drawing frontal facing noses is super fun, but it is a bit tricky because the value is more subtle. Typically speaking as well, this area that we've just added value to will eventually come up and start to form the sockets as well as the eyebrows and give us some placement of where those eyes are going to be. Keep in mind, of course, as we do that, there's always one eye width, And that eye width, believe it or not, is going to be the width of your nostrils. So once I get my nose drawn, I have the placement of my eyes, and I can tell exactly where those eyes need to be in relationship to my nose. So that's our front-facing nose.